The Battle of Okinawa, operationally designated as Operation Iceberg, represented the climactic convergence of American naval power and Japanese defensive desperation in the Pacific theater of World War II. At the leading edge of this massive amphibious undertaking stood Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force of the United States Fifth Fleet. Under the tactical command of Vice Admiral Mark A. Pete Misher, and the overall strategic direction of Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Task Force 58 was not merely a collection of warships, it was a mobile air force of unprecedented destructive power and logistical endurance. The campaign, which stretched from mid-March through late June of 1945, would test the endurance of the fast carrier task force to its breaking point, pitting the material superiority of the United States against the desperate asymmetric tactics of the Japanese Kamikaze Corps. The Battle of Okinawa, operationally designated as Operation Iceberg, represented the climactic convergence of American naval power and Japanese defensive desperation in the Pacific theater of World War II. At the leading edge of this massive amphibious undertaking stood Task Force 58, the fast carrier task force of the United States Fifth Fleet, under the tactical command of Vice Admiral Mark A. Pete Misher and the overall strategic direction of Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Task Force 58 was not merely a collection of warships. It was a mobile air force of unprecedented destructive power and logistical endurance. The campaign, which stretched from mid-March through late June of 1945, would test the endurance of the Fast Carrier Task Force to its breaking point, pitting the material superiority of the United States against the desperate asymmetric tactics of the Japanese Kamikaze Corps. By the spring of 1945, the strategic landscape of the Pacific War had narrowed to the Ryukyu Islands. Following the capture of Iwo Jima, Allied planners required a staging ground for Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of the Japanese home islands. Okinawa, situated roughly 340 miles from Kyushu, offered the necessary airfields and anchorages to support such an endeavor. However, the campaign to seize it would compel the U.S. Navy to operate in a restricted maneuvering box within range of land-based Japanese air power for an extended period. The objective was clear: secure the island of Okinawa to remove the last barrier standing between U.S. forces and Imperial Japan, thereby enabling unchecked strategic airstrikes against the mainland and establishing forward bases for the final invasion. Task Force 58's role in this campaign was multifaceted. It was tasked with establishing air superiority over the objective, neutralizing Japanese airfields on Kyushu and Formosa, providing close air support for the 10th Army ashore, and intercepting any remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The ensuing battle remains a stark historical reminder of the necessity of integrated naval power and the heavy demands placed on warfighters in a prolonged engagement against an enemy determined to wage war of attrition at all costs. By 1945, the Fast Carrier Task Force had matured into the most powerful naval armada in history. The doctrine developed by Misher and his predecessors emphasized the concentration of carrier air power. Rather than dispersing carriers to support individual surface units, the carriers operated in groups, surrounded by a dense screen of fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This formation optimized offensive punch while creating a steel umbrella of anti-aircraft fire to protect the flat tops. The organizational structure of Task Force 58 for the Okinawa campaign was fluid, with specific compositions shifting due to battle damage and logistical rotation. However, the core philosophy remained constant. The force was divided into subordinate task groups, typically numbering 3 or 4. Each task group was a self-contained fighting unit capable of independent operation, but designed to function as part of a coordinated whole. During the critical phases of the Okinawa campaign, Task Force 58 was generally divided into 4 primary task groups. The distribution of heavy carriers and light carriers was designed to balance strike capability with combat air patrol requirements. Task Group 58.1 was commanded by Rear Admiral Clark, with the Hornet, Bennington, Wasp, Hancock, Bellawood, and San Juancito. Task Group 58.2 was commanded by Rear Admiral Davison, with the Franklin, Randolph, Enterprise, and Independence. Task Group 58.3 was commanded by Rear Admiral Sherman, with the Essex, Bunker Hill, Cabot, Bataan. Task Group 58.4 was commanded by Admiral Radford, with the Yorktown, Intrepid, Langley, and Independence. A significant tactical evolution present during the Okinawa campaign was the specialized use of night carriers. The USS Enterprise, the venerable veteran of the early war, along with the light carrier Independence, was designated to operate primarily at night. Loaded exclusively with night fighters, the F-6F Hellcat and night torpedo planes TBM Avengers. Enterprise operated with Task Group 58.4 during the day, but would detach to form a temporary Task Group 58.5, or operate independently at night under the command of Rear Admiral Gardner. This innovation addressed a critical vulnerability, the Japanese realizing that they could not match American air power by day, increasingly turned to twilight and night raids. The presence of a dedicated night combat air patrol allowed Task Force 58 to maintain pressure on a Japanese airfield around the clock, also known as heckler missions, and intercept incoming raids before they could reach the anchorage. This constant pressure was vital for heckling Japanese airfields on Kyushu, preventing the enemy from resting or staging aircraft under the cover of darkness. While the carriers provided the offensive power, the defensive strength of Task Force 58 relied on its screen. This included a concentration of fast new battleships, North Carolina, Washington, South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Missouri, and Wisconsin. Unlike their role in World War I, these dreadnoughts were primarily deployed as massive anti-aircraft platforms, their heavy batteries used for shore bombardment only when the air threat permitted. Beyond the inner screen lay the radar pickets. While many pickets were assigned to the amphibious forces, Task Force 58 deployed its own destroyer screens miles out from the main body. These ships were the first line of defense, tasked with detecting incoming raids and vectoring combat air patrol fighters. They bore the brunt of the Kikusiu attacks, suffering disproportionate losses to save the high-value carriers. The picket line became known as the Graveyard of Destroyers, a grim testament to the effectiveness of the Japanese suicide tactics against isolated ships. Before the amphibious landing scheduled for April 1st, Admiral Spruance determined that the primary threat to the invasion fleet came from land-based aircraft on the Japanese home islands of Kyushu and Honshu. To mitigate this, Task Force 58 was ordered to conduct a series of aggressive fighter sweeps and bombing raids against airfields and naval facilities in the Inland Sea in mid-March of 1945. On March 14th, Task Force 58 departed Ulithi for the final time, steaming north. By March 17th, the task force was between Okinawa and Iwo Jima, turning northwest towards the Japanese mainland. The Japanese response was immediate and ferocious. Unlike the Marianas, where the U.S. fought at the end of a long Japanese tether, here the U.S. Navy was knocking on the enemy's front door. The air battles were intense. On March 18th alone, American aviators claimed 102 enemy aircraft shot down, with hundreds more destroyed on the ground. The attacks focused on Kure and Kobe, targeting oil storage and naval installations. The vulnerability of even the mighty Essex-class carriers brutally demonstrated on the morning of March 19th of 1945. While Task Force 58 launched strikes against Kure and Kobe, a single Japanese dive bomber, utilizing cloud cover and surprise, penetrated the defenses of Task Group 58.2. It dropped two 550-pound semi-armor-piercing bombs on the USS Franklin. The timing was catastrophic. The Franklin had 31 aircraft armed and fueled on the flight deck, awaiting launch. The bombs penetrated to the hangar deck, igniting gasoline and detonating ordnance, including massive Tiny Tim rockets. The resulting chain reaction turned the ship into an inferno. Over 800 sailors were killed, and 487 were wounded. The fires were so intense that observers on nearby ships saw men running on deck as flaming torches and assumed the ship was doomed. The survival of the Franklin is regarded as one of the greatest feats of damage control in naval history. Despite being dead in the water, listing 13 degrees, and drifting within 50 miles of the Japanese coast, the crew saved the ship. The cruiser USS Santa Fe came alongside to rescue survivors and assist in fighting fires. Ultimately, Franklin was towed to safety and eventually steamed under her own power to Brooklyn, New York. However, the operational impact was immediate. Franklin was effectively removed from the war, and the carrier Wasp was also severely damaged by a bomb hit the same day, necessitating her return to Ulithi for repairs. The USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown also suffered damage from bomb hits and near misses during these initial raids. Within 5 days of the campaign's start, Task Force 58 had temporarily lost significant projection of power, forcing a reorganization of the task groups and highlighting the extreme danger of operating within range of land-based air power. Despite the damage to the carriers, the March strikes achieved significant attrition of Japanese naval power. On March 19th, aircraft from Task Group 58.1, 58.3, and 58.4 struck the Japanese fleet harbored in the Inland Sea. They damaged the battleship Yamato, the carrier Amagi, and the cruiser Yodo. The anti-aircraft fire from Kure was described as the most intense experienced by Task Group 58 aviators to date, with 11 Helldivers and 2 Avengers shot down. These strikes forced the Japanese Navy to reserve its remaining strength for the final desperate sortie, setting the stage for Operation 10 Go. On April 1st of 1945, Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, the amphibious assault on Okinawa began. While the landings themselves were initially unopposed, the naval war offshore immediately intensified. Task Force 58 took station east of Okinawa, operating in a roughly 60-mile square box. From this position, they provided a big blue blanket of air cover, flying constant missions over the amphibious area and the task force itself. For the first few days, Japanese air opposition was relatively light, leading to false sense of security. However, this was calculated by the Japanese command, who were assuming the aircraft for coordinated mass attacks. The Japanese military, recognizing their inability to match Allied production or pilot training, formally adopted suicide tactics as primary doctrine. This was not the sporadic kamikaze effort seen in the Philippines. This was kikuchi, or floating chrysanthemums. massed waves of suicide aircraft coordinated to saturate American defenses. The Japanese deployed both conventional aircraft and specialized suicide weapons like the Oka, or Baka bomb, a rocket-powered manned glider. Between April 6 and June 22nd, the Japanese launched 10 massive Kikuchi attacks, interspersed with smaller daily raids. These attacks involved hundreds of aircraft, conventional fighters, dive bombers, and trainers, all packed with explosives. The psychological strain on the crews of Task Force 58 was immense. There was no front line. Death could arrive from any quadrant of the sky at any moment. To protect the main body of the fleet and the transports, the U.S. Navy established a ring of radar picket stations around Okinawa. These stations were manned primarily by destroyers, whose job was to detect incoming raids and vector fighters to intercept them. Because they were often the first ships the kamikazes encountered, the pickets became the primary targets for many of these suicide pilots. The losses among the picket ships were staggering. Destroyers such as USS Bush, USS Calhoun, USS Manert L. Able, and USS Pringle were sunk after being overwhelmed by multiple hits. The Manert L. Able holds the grim distinction of being the first ship sunk by an Oka rocket bomb. The destroyer USS William D. Porter, famous for its accidental torpedo shot at President Roosevelt earlier in the war, was also lost to a kamikaze during the campaign. The picket duty was so hazardous that it depleted the destroyer force significantly, forcing the Navy to keep the main carrier groups on a constant alert to backstop the crumbling outer defenses. To counter this, Task Force 58 evolved its defensive tactics. The number of fighters on each carrier was increased, often at the expense of dive bombers and torpedo planes. The standard air group complement shifted significantly. By April, light carriers were practically all fighter ships. Task Force 58 destroyed 2,300 aircraft. Despite these measures, the leakers, the planes that slipped through, caused havoc. The sheer volume of attacks meant that even a 90% interception rate left enough planes to damage or sink ships. In a parallel effort to the air attacks, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched Operation Ten-Go. The plan called for the super battleship Yamato, the light cruiser Yagahi, and 8 destroyers to fight their way to Okinawa, beached themselves, and used their massive guns as coastal artillery batteries until destroyed. U.S. intelligence, specifically Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, had intercepted and decrypted the orders for the operation as early as March 26. Admiral Spruance and Admiral Misher were aware of the story before many of the Japanese sailors were on the Yamato. While Spruance initially positioned his battleships, Task Force 54, to engage the Yamato in a surface action, Misher, an aviator to his core, intended to prove that air power alone could destroy the world's largest battleship. On the morning of April 7th of 1945, search planes from Task Force 58 located the Japanese surface force in the East China Sea. Misher, without waiting for explicit confirmation from Spruance, ordered the launch of a massive strike force. The strike force of 386 aircraft was launched from Task Group 58.1, commanded by Rear Admiral Clark, and Task Group 58.3, commanded by Rear Admiral Sherman. The weather was poor, with low clouds and rain squalls, but the Americans possessed a crucial advantage. The Yamato had no air cover. The Japanese fighters were all reserved for the Kikuchi attacks, or defense of the homeland. The attack was a methodical execution. First, fighters strafed the decks to suppress anti-aircraft fire. Then, Avengers, armed with torpedoes, and Helldivers, armed with armor-piercing bombs, commenced coordinated runs. The American pilots concentrated their torpedo attacks on the Yamato's port side. This was a deliberate tactic to induce flooding on the one side, making counter-flooding difficult and causing the ship to capsize. The armada absorbed punishment that would have obliterated any other ship, at least 11 torpedoes and 6 bombs. However, she could not withstand the onslaught indefinitely. At 14:23 hours, the armada capsized and exploded, sending a mushroom cloud miles into the sky. Along with the armada, the cruiser Yagai and 4 destroyers were also sunk. Task Force 58 lost 10 aircraft and 12 airmen killed. The Japanese lost over 4,000 men, including the task force commander, Vice Admiral Ito. The engagement definitely ended the debate regarding the dominance of the aircraft carrier over the battleship. Following the destruction of Yamato, Task Force 58 returned to the grinding routine of support operations off Okinawa. This period, extending through April and May, tested the limits of human endurance. Crews remained at general quarters for hours on end. Sleep was fragmented, and the stress of potential kamikaze impacts was constant. Admiral Nimitz, recognizing the unprecedented strain of the campaign that kept the fleet at sea for months, implemented a rotation policy for the High Command. This allowed commanders to rest and plan future operations while maintaining the operational readiness. However, for the sailors and airmen, there was no rotation. On May 11th of 1945, the war came directly to Vice Admiral Misher. His flagship, the USS Bunker Hill, was operating with Task Group 58.3 east of Okinawa. At 10:05 a.m., while the flight deck was packed with planes fueled and armed for a strike against Kyushu, 2 kamikazes struck in rapid succession. A Zero fighter dropped a 550-pound bomb that penetrated the flight deck and exited the side of the hull before the plane itself crashed into the parked aircraft. Seconds later, a second Zero plunged into the flight deck near the island superstructure. Its bomb penetrated the pilot's ready room, instantly killing 22 members of Squadron VF-84. The resulting fires were catastrophic. Toxic smoke from burning aviation fuel and melting material was sucked into the ship's ventilation system, asphyxiating hundreds of men below decks. The final death toll was 396 killed and 264 wounded, the single deadliest kamikaze attack on the U.S. ship in the war. Misher and his staff were forced to evacuate the bridge as the island became engulfed in smoke. Commodore Arleigh Burke, Misher's chief of staff, played a heroic role in rescuing men from the inferno. The Bunker Hill was saved but was out of the war. Misher transferred his flag to the USS Enterprise. 3 days later, on May 14th, the Enterprise was targeted. A kamikaze pilot, utilizing cloud cover, dove on the carrier. The plane crashed just aft of the forward elevator. The explosion blew the heavy elevator structure hundreds of feet into the air. While Enterprise survived, she was no longer combat effective. Misher was forced to transfer his flag yet again, this time to USS Randolph. This systematic targeting of the carriers demonstrated that while the Japanese could not win the battle, they could inflict severe punishment on the U.S. Navy's most valuable assets. One of the most remarkable aspects of Task Force 58's performance at Okinawa was its ability to remain on station for 79 continuous days. This was made possible by the At-Sea Logistics Service Group, designated Task Group 50.8. This floating logistics train provided fuel, ammunition, replacement aircraft, and provisions to the fleet while underway. The ability to replenish at sea meant that Task Force 58 did not have to return to Ulithi or Guam to rearm. Carrier aircraft could be replaced within hours of a loss. This capability demoralized Japanese, who expected the American fleet to eventually withdraw for supplies, offering a respite that never came. The scale of operations conducted by Task Force 58 during the Okinawa campaign is staggering. The action reports detailed the destruction inflicted upon the enemy. However, the cost was high. By the end of the campaign, 36 ships of the Fifth Fleet had been sunk and 368 damaged, with the vast majority of casualties inflicted by kamikazes. A unique feature of the Pacific War's late stages was the commanding rotation system. The physical ships of the fast carrier task force remained the same, but the command structure and designation changed. On May 28th, 1945, Admiral Halsey arrived on board the USS Missouri to relieve Spruance. Vice Admiral McCain relieved the exhausted Misher. At midnight, Task Force 58 officially became Task Force 38. This transition allowed the primary commanders to return to Pearl Harbor to plan the invasion of Japan, while the fleet continued to pressure the enemy. The transition also served a counterintelligence purpose. The Japanese believed they were facing two separate massive fleets, one commanded by Spruance and one by Halsey, not realizing it was the same set of ships with rotating commanders. With the capture of Okinawa largely secured by late June, the fast carrier task force, now Task Force 38, departed the Ryukyu Islands to begin the final bombardment of the Japanese home islands. The Battle of Okinawa had been the testing ground for the tactics that would have been used in the invasion of Japan, dealing with mass suicide attacks, integrating heavy radar picket screens, and sustaining a massive fleet at sea for months. The performance of Task Force 58 during the Battle of Okinawa stands as a testament to the maturation of carrier aviation and the industrial might of the United States. In the span of 3 months, the force neutralized the remaining surface strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy, suppressed land-based air power on the home islands, and supported the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. The campaign also revealed the terrifying cost of invading the Japanese homeland. The damage inflicted on flagships like Bunker Hill and Enterprise by kamikazes foreshadowed the carnage expected during the invasion of Kyushu. The data gathered by Task Force 58 regarding the effectiveness of suicide tactics and the heavy cost in naval lives weighed heavily on the decision-making process that ultimately led to the use of atomic weapons to end the war. Task Force 58 at Okinawa represents the birth of the modern sustainable carrier strike group, a force capable of projecting power indefinitely, independent of land bases.